Jazz is a complicated and even contested word for an immense body of musical works produced from the late 19th century through today. The music occupies a rather curious status in the United States' history and culture as both a form of music once deemed the devil's music by elite white persons who feared its interracial appeal, and it's also a revered style of music considered by some as America's classical music. Over the years, jazz has evolved and blended as generation after generation draws upon the philosophies, the ambitions, and musical innovations of jazz to inspire their own music. Exploring the rich history of jazz, including and beyond the more familiar names of big band leaders, reveals a rich history of music that could fall within a wide variety of stylistic categories. But to step back and explain what all this means, I'd like to briefly touch on what a genre is, the origins and evolutions of jazz, and some artists that we can look to for inspiration and as models for how to follow our creative passions and interests. Through their music, they demonstrate how artists grow over time and use their music to convey a message. But first, I'd like to start with a definition of a genre. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines a genre as a category of artistic, musical, or literary composition characterized by a particular style, form, or content. We use genres to describe an assemblage of music with similarities in sound, style, audience, region, or even performance type. Hopefully, genres provide listeners with an idea of what they can expect from the music sonically or mood-wise. Not everyone's a musician, remember, and musicians and their colleagues in the business side of the industry use genres to rather guide those who might need a little help in finding music that appeals to them. Genres might also impact where music is heard and how artists are awarded for their performances. Genres impact where music is released and heard and determine what types of radio stations a piece of music might be played on, what kind of program a musician or a piece of music might be included in. That could include a concert series, maybe a festival, or other types of big event performances. Music is also prioritized with audiences through genres, and that means that genres are a marketing tool that help business people determine where to promote music in certain areas or with certain populations, with certain age groups and other demographic information. Genres also might determine where music is performed, what types of venues it's heard at. Musicians tend to gravitate towards venues where music they appreciate is being played or they know they'll find the audiences that connect with their music. But generally, venues are identified with a certain style or genre of music and a type of audience that appeals to that type of music or wants to hear that type of music. Think about jazz clubs, coffee houses, orchestra halls. You have to think about how an audience takes in that music, the atmosphere of a venue, and the protocols or behaviors that are acceptable within that type of performance venue. Is an audience silent? Do they chatter over the music? A lot of that is often determined by genres and how people consume that music. But it's also important to keep in mind that genres can also be misleading. Genres are fantastic tools for breaking music into categories for the public market, but that doesn't always provide flexibility for the artist's interpretation of their own work or for them to acknowledge the multitude of styles that informed their music. Sometimes it's also difficult for people to merge away from a genre once they've been associated with it. If musicians move up in the industry, they might feel pressured to be consistent in their musical output to maintain sales or quotas. Agents and business executives have goals and expectations that don't always encourage or accommodate creative expression. Relatedly, sometimes musicians struggle to receive support for the directions that they want to take with their music when it seemingly conflicts with their training or association with a particular genre. Some teachers discourage their students from listening or performing genres outside of their specific discipline, for example. They believe that it allows a student to really hone in and focus on this type of music that they're learning. Some students don't heed those requests or demands, but those types of requests could prompt students not to follow their curiosities while they focus on their studies. And there's nothing wrong with focusing on the music or listening to your teacher if that's what you want, but it's also important to keep in mind that some students need that type of flexibility, and that listening to other music and incorporating it into your specific genre studies should be viewed as an addition, not necessarily a subtraction. Sometimes musicians are also tied or have a difficult relationship with genres because of discrimination that they face. A lot of musicians do face discrimination while working as musicians, but sometimes genres, certain styles, prove to be racist environments, so musicians have to alter their path to work in an industry or have stable employment. For example, many classical musicians from communities of color struggle to maintain employment or even get opportunities to audition for mainstream orchestras or symphonies, so sometimes they pivot and work in other areas or engage in experimental or fusion styles in a different type of work lifestyle and culture. For example, bassist Paul Chambers had aspired to be a classical musician when he was a young teenager in Detroit, but he was told he wouldn't have a career in classical music, so he circled to jazz. Detroit had a thriving jazz scene, and he was able to grow into the bop and post-bop eras, where he became an in-demand rhythm section player who brought innovative bowing techniques to the jazz atmosphere and jazz canon. Genres also intermingle. Genres come and go as our society and culture apply them, and they're always intermingling with other styles and shifting with tastes in popular opinion or in artistic expression. They're not static, and they take on influences and developments as musicians and audiences grow. Musicians, as creative people, produce music that reflects the conversations they're having, the music that surrounds them, the styles that intrigue them, and more importantly, the world that is occurring and unfolding around them. Music doesn't happen in a vacuum and is very responsive to the symptoms, the systems, and the lifestyles that it's produced within. And so I'd like to just take a moment and think about how pop music has changed over the last several years. What rhythms and styles are at the forefront? What types of patterns do you notice have occurred or been consistently popular within the last several years? And why might that be? Who's getting opportunities? Who's not? And what types of patterns are becoming more popular because they perform well? That's something to kind of guide you in thinking about how genres intermingle and how different styles come to the forefront and fade backwards as we change and as we grow and as populations change. It's important to think of genres as an extension of human expression. And as people intermingle and travel the world or engage with artists outside of their typical communities, genres change. Music is communicative and responsive. Artists travel and encounter new music or study genres that they're interested in and incorporate elements from those types of studies into their own music, which sometimes also filters into broader communities. Migrating artists also greatly enhance musical soundscapes of a region, while also maybe informing other genres and drawing attention to multicultural aspects of musicking. This is particular in the United States over the last several decades, last several centuries, as people from all over the world have traveled and made their homes in the United States. Bringing everything back to jazz, it's important to also touch on the origins of jazz. The early history of jazz is a very difficult thing to determine, and unfortunately, it's not as simple as saying that jazz came from New Orleans and is the product of a mixture of Western and African influences. In reality, jazz came from all over and was influenced by people from all around the world who have engaged with the music. While New Orleans, of course, had a prominent brass band community extending to the 19th century that significantly impacted the evolution of jazz, it wasn't even the only city or region within the United States with a significant brass band tradition. Some other regions with strong traditions that influenced jazz could be Puerto Rico, for example, which became a territory of the United States in the 1890s. The island Commonwealth's native musicians have regularly migrated to the United States over the last century and engaged in music making with mainstream audiences and mainstream music traditions such as jazz. I'd like to take a moment to describe briefly the history of Black music as well as an intergenre conversation. And I'd like to use Mary Lou Williams' History of Jazz Tree as an example. She used this as a teaching aid to teach students about the rich history of jazz and its roots within the African American community from her perspective. And so she drew it from a tree, with the roots being the suffering and cultural displacement of African American people, leading into the spirituals that they created within their communities, and then into ragtime. And she then takes jazz into Kansas City swing and bop. And then the bark of the tree, the bark around the trunk of the tree is the blues. The blues surrounds this history and feeds all of it while reaching into branches which go into commercial music and rock music and avant-garde music. And then the leaves of the tree, as she sees it, are all of these artists that have influenced jazz and its succeeding genres and styles that have fed off of its influences. And this is a really great vehicle for talking about the stylistic conversations within jazz and how jazz is a very broad umbrella term. As Mary Lou Williams' tree demonstrates, jazz is a combination of creative expression and how musicians have evolved and brought new things to the conversation and ongoing history of jazz, which is why it's important to highlight that some musicians had difficulties with their categorization as jazz musicians. Because in the 20th century, jazz became a sort of catch-all for music primarily produced by Black musicians whose musical hybridity couldn't be easily categorized, some musicians resisted that. For example, Nina Simone. She initially aspired to be a classical concert pianist, but found herself emerging as a commercial jazz artist in the late 1950s. And she felt boxed in by this because she initially pursued this just to pay for her classical studies and to fund her aspirations to be a concert pianist. But the commercial industry put her in jazz because she played jazz and she played folk music and she played this strange, eclectic repertoire that they couldn't quite capture the nuance of her creativity with commercially to market her. Cross-genre developments have come about through creative expression over the years many, many times. Bebop is a great example, as I mentioned earlier with Paul Chambers, with the classical musicians blending with the jazz musicians, while also blending with the older generations. Mary Lou Williams is an example. She was a pioneer of bop and continued to evolve over the years and sometimes struggled with recording companies who couldn't quite understand or fully get behind the complexity of her musical ideas. She also pioneered sacred jazz music in the mid-20th century. She became the first person to write a jazz mass after years of campaigning to the Catholic Church to support the composition of one. She drew from her base, her grounding in jazz, to inform this sacred music that she'd been interested in over the past several decades, as well as the choral music that she was experimenting with to compose sacred works that were different from the traditional sacred masses heard in a Catholic church. And she also took that opportunity to honor lesser-known figures like Saint Martin de Porres, who was a Peruvian saint. Another artist who benefited and persevered in their creative expression was Sun Ra, who was a band leader, a composer, and a keyboardist who truly also defied category. Sun Ra's music was characterized by the spiritual, philosophical, socially conscious, and fantastical ideas he brought and imbued in his music. It drew from across the musical spectrum, but also on ideas from across the world and ways of thinking that made his music more experiential and thought-provoking. His performances couldn't just be described as performances, but should also be described as performance art because they pushed a message they created a show just beyond entertainment. They made audiences think and have conversations. Sun Ra's music pioneered Afrofuturism and jazz and brought these science fiction ideas into the music that helped project this idea of what a different world could look like. Another musician who benefited from freedom of creative expression within the jazz atmosphere was Miles Davis during his electric period. During this time period, he brought in new instrumentation and produced a significantly different sound from his previous eras in his life. It was also a reflection of the different people who he was engaging with outside of the jazz industry and community that he had traditionally been associated with. During this time, he was engaging with a younger generation, including his then wife, Betty Davis, who introduced him to rock music and funk music. She was friends with people like Sly Stone and Jimi Hendrix and was an innovative musician herself who exposed Miles to this different soundscape that pushed his music into new directions as he also experimented with it and applied it to his interpretation of the world. And so this all matters for a lot of reasons because, firstly, it means that you can be interested in playing any kind of music that you want. You don't have to be firmly attached to a certain style or genre. Being a musician can, and usually does, include playing a wide variety of styles or genres of music. Secondly, it means that you have role models and musical predecessors from across the spectrum of music whose careers and output you can study and draw upon to inform whatever music you choose to make. There is a niche for everyone.